Hello everybody. Today I'm going to start our lecture with this quotation. Though much of the diplomatic activity is bilateral in character, the new diplomacy puts greater emphasis on the multilateral side of diplomatic practice. Therefore, diplomats have to move from one context to the other, no matter where they happen to be posted, at the United Nations in New York or at the Court of St. James in London. Today's lecture, as you understood, devoted to the evolution of multilateral diplomacy. Before listening, think of the possible answers to the following questions. The first is, what is the difference between the old diplomacy and the new diplomacy? Do you think the old and new types are associated with time or something else? Second, to which of the above mentioned terms does the French system of diplomacy belong? From the course of diplomacy, do you remember what the system comprises? And the third question, in what way were the tasks of the diplomatic professions broadened nowadays? Now let's start. The evolution of multilateral diplomacy. Diplomacy is the method by which nation-states, through authorized agents, maintain mutual relations, communicate with each other, and carry out political, economic, and legal transactions. Although the roots of diplomacy reach back to the beginning of organized human society, the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 is generally believed to be the origin of diplomacy as an institution, since it marked the beginning of the European nation-state system, which initially consisted of 12 well-defined sovereign states, and codified the rules of conduct among sovereign and equal states. The Westphalian principles of sovereignty and the territorial states that were established in the 17th century are the foundation of today's multilateral diplomatic system. The history of diplomacy is commonly divided between the old diplomacy and reached its zenith in the 19th century and the new diplomacy of 20s. The old diplomacy or bilateral diplomacy was dominated for almost 300 years by the French system of diplomacy, which established and developed several key features of contemporary diplomacy: resident ambassadors, secret negotiations, ceremonial duties and protocol, honesty and professionalism. All diplomacy was predominantly limited to the conduct of relations on a state-to-state basis via resident missions, embassies, with the resident ambassador being the key actor. The new diplomacy that emerged in the 19th century and found its fullest expression in the 20s is distinguished from the old by two themes. First, the demand that diplomacy should be more open to public scrutiny and control. And the second, the projected establishment of an international organization which would be both act a forum for the peaceful settlement of disputes and as a deterrent to the waging of aggressive war. The Vestiges of the old diplomacy rapidly faded into the background after World War II, when the Standing Diplomatic Conference, or as it is more commonly known, International Organization, or is it more commonly known International Organization, and multilateral diplomacy blossomed. By the middle of the 20th century, the international arena had become too big and too complex for traditional bilateral diplomacy to manage, unleashing the unprecedented drive of the past 50 years to build international and regional organizations with defined rules of procedure. By the middle of the 20th century, the international arena had become too big and too complex for traditional bilateral diplomacy to manage, unleashing the unprecedented drive of the past 50 years to build international and regional organizations with defined rules of procedure, permanent secretariats, and permanently accredited diplomatic missions, and gradually shifting the emphasis in diplomatic methods from traditional bilateralism to multilateralism. This was a particularly important development in international relations. As a sequence, the new diplomacy, especially as it is manifested in the United Nations, broadened the task of the profession, subtly changing how diplomats conduct their trade. Today, the task of a diplomat include, first, formal and substantive representation. The former involves presentation of credentials, protocol, and participation in the diplomatic circuit of a national capital or an international or regional institution, while the latter includes explanation and defense of national policies and negotiations with other governments. The second, information gathering, acting as a listening post. The third is laying the groundwork or preparing the basis for a policy or new initiatives. The fourth, reducing interstate frictions or oiling the wheels of bilateral or multilateral relations. The fifth, managing order and change. And the sixth, creating, drafting, and amending international normative and regulatory rules. Multilateral diplomacy emphasizes diplomats' public speaking, debating, and language skills, since communications are conducted principally by means of verbal, face-to-face exchanges rather than in the predominantly written style of bilateral diplomacy. The expansion and intertwining of political, economic, and social issues and concerns on the agenda of multilateral diplomacy have pushed diplomats toward greater specialization and increased involvement in external affairs of domestic ministries, such as those concerned with agriculture, civil aviation, finance, and health. As Sir David Hannay, former permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the United Nations, points out, you have to have a reasonable spread of specialization. You now certainly have to have military advice, and on the development side, you have to have people who know something about environment, who know something about population control, who know something about wider development policies. Also, multilateral diplomacy has overlaid the task of the international system on the diplomat's traditional function of advancing and protecting national interest within the system. Now, thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.